What are we really talking about when we talk about podcasts? It seems like every podcaster you talk to thinks they know what their audience likes, but do they?
Special thanks to our partners for making Sounds Profitable possible. Check them out by going to soundsprofitable.com and click on every single logo in the articles.
Welcome to the Sounds Profitable podcast. I'm Arielle Nissenblatt. On the show today, I'm speaking with Sounds Profitable partner Tom Webster about an article he wrote recently called What We Talk About When We Talk About Podcasts. The goal of this article is to help creators understand what their listeners really think about them and to then use those findings to improve and reach new audiences. We'll get into that, as well as tactics for asking great questions, actually getting responses, and so much more. But first, Tom, how are you? It's been a while since we've recorded. Since we recorded last, we went to Vegas, we went to Austin. What's been going on?
It was a good trip, and it was great to see you in both locations. So, we had the Sounds Profitable Lounge at Podcast Movement Evolutions, which was Podcast Evolution's hottest club, I think. This place had everything. No, it was fantastic. And then we took the trip to Austin, where we had another Sounds Profitable partner event, which you attended, and we previewed some research, which I know we'll be talking about in a future episode to come. But it was just great to see everybody. It's great to see you and not just virtual you, not just Squadcast you,
IRL.
but you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we learned about grackles. What are grackles, Tom?
So a grackle is an interesting bird. A grackle is essentially what you get if you cross a roadrunner with a vacuum cleaner or jet engine. And they group in like gatherings of 500, whatever you call a group of gackles. It's not a murder, but it's something worse, I think. And we had our event outside, and I was giving a presentation of some research outdoors in front of about 120 partners, agency folks, and somewhere between 800 and 50,000 grackles. And they were not welcome guests, I have to say. They're very loud.
No, they were loud, but you rolled with it. And honestly, I now know what a grackle is, so I'm grateful.
Yeah. Well, there's that. Yeah. So if you got nothing else out of that presentation, Arielle, you know what a grackle is.
Thank God. So, Tom, what do we talk about when we talk about podcasts? First, I want to know how you came up with the title for this. So there's a book called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. There's another book called What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank. How did this come about, What We Talk About When We Talk About Podcasts?
Well, it was What We Talk About When We Talk About Love was what crossed my mind
Not the Anne
first.
Frank one. Okay, cool.
And not
cool.
not the Anne Frank one, though I was certainly aware of the Anne Frank one. But no, it was What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And it sort of triggered this thought with me that we don't really talk to people about our podcasts particularly effectively, right? We can promote our podcasts and we can say, hey, listen, it does this, that, and this, but actually talking to people about what they like about your podcast, because this is something that I've made I'm trained in it. It's a craft for me in all the focus groups I've done. How do you talk to people about things that they aren't necessarily equipped to talk about because they're not that important to them? So that's kind of where it came from.
Yeah, in the article, you ask a question that a lot of creators really do want to understand, which is how do you make your podcast recommendable? It could be every week you put out an episode and the people who are already subscribed to it will get a notification. Maybe they'll hit play. But how do you make sure that those people recommend it beyond just listening to it themselves? So first, I want to ask you, what makes this show recommendable? Have you done the analysis for yourself?
It's not. It's entirely not recommendable. I don't know. I hope it's recommendable. I mean, it's a thing that I do think about a lot. I mean, what I hope would make this show recommendable is that it's a show for people who are curious about the inner workings of the podcasting industry or sort of advanced podcasting, and are looking for a way to have it explained to them in a way that's engaging and hopefully entertaining, right? That's what I would hope. But what makes any show recommendable, I think what gets lost there sometimes is that when there is a recommendation in space, in a vacuum, there are three components to that, right? There's the recommender, there's the recommendation, and then there's the recommendee. And I think it's the recommendee, the person to whom you are recommending the show, that is the most important, because when you make a recommendation, you're trying to come up with something that will fit that person like a glove. So not just something that you think is great, but something that, you know what, I bet this other person will think this is great because this is something that they're dealing with. So I think that's a big part of what makes a show recommendable.
You and I were recently on a phone call with Lauren Passell, who runs Tink Media, and we were talking about how to get more people to listen to podcasts. And we'll go into this towards the back half of the show. But one thing that you said to us that stuck with us was, don't get cute with your recommendations, right? Maybe you have a friend who really loves knitting and you're going to find some very niche knitting podcast that gets 500 downloads an episode. And it's great, but it doesn't have mass appeal. So what did you mean by that?
This is something that this may be difficult for some content creators to hear. Podcasting is just on the cusp of mainstream America. I mean, it is, certainly as a percentage of reaching Americans, it's already quite high. But, there's this sort of middle America that, that watches The Bachelor, that watches NYPD Blue, watches Dateline NBC, all of this stuff. And they're not necessarily into podcasts just yet. And it's easy for people that have been podcasting for a long time and some kind of niche topic to sort of look down your snoot at that kind of entertainment or that kind of content. But here's the thing: the people who enjoy that kind of content actually have the highest standards. Their standards are higher than anybody's, because that content is so well produced and so brilliantly structured, organized, acted, polished to a sheen. That's what mainstream Americans are used to, right? So if you're going to recommend a podcast, maybe that person that has never listened to a podcast before, maybe they would enjoy that. It's hard to say niche knitting. Maybe they would enjoy that podcast, but honestly, the first thing I would recommend to them would be the best of what we have. It would be something that, is a smash top 50, highly produced, demonstrably popular smash hit, right?
Yeah.
If someone says, I like storytelling, maybe there's a sort of twisted, unique storytelling podcast that they might enjoy as their second show. But the first thing I'm going to introduce to them is The Moth or Lore or something like that.
Yeah. Get them into it first.
Make sure that what you're giving them is of the quality that frankly, that they're used to with the kind of mainstream entertainment that they already consume.
Let's get to some larger context around this. Many creators, you say in the article, have mastered one of two very important things, either the process of podcasting or the knowledge of your audience. But we need to move to have more people understanding both of these concepts. How do we do that?
Well, I think most people focus on the process of podcasting. That's the easy thing. You can read a book, you can get a better mic, you can learn how to edit. The hard part is understanding your audience. And one of the things that I write about in that article is, I think one of the biggest lies that a podcaster can tell themselves is, well, I know my audience. Well, how do you know your audience? People may have self-selected to listen to your show for one reason or another, but how much do you actually know about them, and how can you, continue to surprise and delight them unless you know what surprises and delights them? So I do think that that's one of the things that podcasters sort of delude themselves about, is that they know their audience, because I know they don't.
And how much do you really need to know about them? For example, I put out a weekly podcast recommendation podcast, and I get people who post on social that they've listened to it. They tag me in things that say, thanks for the great recommendations. I then go on Good Pods and I see that people are listening to it and liking it and commenting on it. But so I know who they are, right? Like, those people have self-selected to let me know who they are. But do I really know them? Do I know what makes them tick? Do I know what other podcasts they're listening to? Do I know if they're creators themselves? The answer is no. I haven't taken the time to figure that out.
Yeah, and actually, just for that show in particular, Arielle, I think one thing that I would love to know is, what is the sort of podcast journey of these people? Have they found one podcast and now they want to know more about podcasting, or do they listen to like 9 a week and they're looking for the 10th?
Right.
Like, that's a huge variable, and that would be a cool thing, I think, for you to know about your audience, because it might change the quality of nature of your recommendations. And that just seems like a small thing, but it actually can have a significant impact on your content.
Totally. Let's go through the questions that you suggest publishers ask of their audience in this article that we're talking about. I think that when most people dream of receiving feedback from their audience, they wouldn't automatically think of these questions. They ask usually questions that are pretty surface level. And you wrote it out. You said, what do you think of my podcast is a mediocre question that will elicit a mediocre response because people don't really have the vocabulary. If you say, how's your day? Someone's going to say good. It's a mediocre question that gets a mediocre response, right? Same with the podcast question.
Yeah, and this is from doing years and years of focus groups. I used to do focus group. I mean, I've done them for all kinds of products and things like that. I used to do a lot in different radio formats years ago, and you would ask somebody what they think of a station, and they would say, "It's I don't know, it's good. I like it." Well, why do you like it? I like the music. Why do you like the music? It's good. And so you're just trapped in this sort of, and it's not that they're stupid. It's that it's not that important to them. It's not something that they think about every day.
You're not giving them great questions.
You're not giving them great questions.
It's on you.
It's on, yeah, that's right. It's on me. So I remember the first time I was kind of training to do focus groups and things like that. I was watching one of my mentors, and instead of asking those kinds of questions, he would ask things like, well, if this radio station were a car, what kind of car would it be?
Whoa.
Like, I don't know, be a nice family sedan with, and that unlocks another part of someone's vocabulary.
That's good. That's really good. Well, okay. Actually, you know how Podchaser goes on Twitter and writes, if your podcast could be a smell, what would it be?
Mm-hmm.
I think this is an argument that those are actually good tweets.
Those are good questions to have other people answer about your show. Yeah, I think they are actually.
Yeah. So if you haven't checked out Podchaser's Twitter, I think I have definitely poked fun at it before, but hey, this is unlocking something new for me. Speaking of unlocking, I think the following 5 questions will unlock something new for creators if they're lucky enough to get honest feedback. So let's go into those. First up, how did you discover my show? If I ask this of my listeners, what's my goal, Tom?
Your goal is to get beyond the kind of survey question where the answers are Apple Podcasts, a recommendation from a friend, search, right? Like those are the
Not
the
where,
kind of survey
but how.
answers. What? Yeah, how? Exactly. How? What were these? If you were searching for it, what were you searching for? Why? What were you not finding? Like, just dig in on that a little bit. All of these questions that we're going to talk about, you could ask just one of them. That's all you need, and just kind of dig in on it a little bit. If someone recommended the show to you, what was the context of that? What were you asking for? Because all of that stuff is going to give you the sort of, we talk about the kind of the why of your podcast, but it's the how is more important in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I think also when you get this information back from your listeners, you can then double down on marketing efforts. And we're not there yet, but this is sort of what you do when you take this information and you can synthesize it and make changes. But if you find out that somebody discovered your show by way of a QR code on the back of a sports bar bathroom, then maybe you go to more sports bars and stick some more QR codes on urinals.
Yeah, and as part of that sort of, let's say it was again from a recommendation from a friend, what's the language that they used, right? When they talked about your show, maybe it's not language that you would use to describe your show, but maybe you need to know that.
Yeah, actually, this article that you wrote inspired me, and I really want to find out. I want to hear how people are referring to my podcast recommendation newsletter when I'm not the one explaining it. I say it's 5 podcast episodes on a theme, each week curated by a different person. That's a rehearsed line that I've been saying for 5 years. I wonder how somebody else says, what is earbuds, right? So I would love, I'm going to be asking that of my friends to maybe record voice clips and let me know.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah. Next question that you propose is, what other podcasts do you listen to? Why would I ask this one?
Level 1 of this question is so you can find other shows to do cross promotion or buy ads in and stuff like that. That's sort of the level 1 marketing, promotion level of that question. The deeper level, though, is to find out who these people are when they're at home. And I think one of the examples I gave is, if let's say you're doing a sports podcast, is this the only other sports podcast they listen to, or is this one of 5 other sports podcasts? What is the job that show is doing? And what else are they listening to? And I think you might be surprised, if let's say that you are someone who is, let's say you're someone who's politically violently opposed to Joe Rogan, and you talk to a bunch of your listeners and find out that a bunch of them also listen to Joe Rogan. Don't you want to know why that is? What is the common thread there? It may not be a thread that is visible to you, And it's questions like that that help you gain insight into exactly the slice of humanity that your show is appealing to.
The next question I really love because it's very specific. It is, would you make my show longer or shorter? Or would you make my show longer, comma, shorter, specifically? And tell me why it's worded that way.
It's worded that way because it's sort of the counter to one of the worst questions I hear bandied about in podcasting. How long should my podcast be? Write this down. Shorter than the last one.
Ah.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
No, I like this question. Would you make the show shorter or longer? Because it's going to prompt a better follow-up question, right? A bad question is, how long should my show be? And someone says 22 minutes, and then you cut it to 22. That's dumb.
But then you also have to hold yourself to 22 minutes, and that's annoying.
That's really annoying. It's especially annoying for me since I have no ability to do that.
Same.
But if someone says, "Oh, I think your podcast should be shorter," you're not looking for a time thing here. You're just shorter. Okay, what would you cut? Because when someone says it should be shorter, that's not coming from the length of your show. That's coming from it feels too long. That's different. It feels too long, or it feels too short, and that's a wonderful thing. That means it just gets going and people want to hear more. Well, what is the thing you want to hear more of? So that's why I love that question.
Yeah, and if it's too long, then where am I boring you? Where are you dropping off?
Exactly.
The next question you have is more of a command. Think of a family member or a friend who would like the show. Tell me about them.
It's either a command or it's step one of a mentalism routine. Now I want you to think of a card. I love this question.
Command. Because
it's a bit of a two-parter, and you could spend all your time on this question. And that is, again, think about someone that you would recommend this show to. And you're talking to one of your listeners here. All right. So you're asking, hey, listener, who would you recommend this show to? And what you're looking for them to do is two things. Number one, describe that friend. Who is that friend when they're at home? What are their tastes? What's their personality like? What do they wear? Why did that person come to mind as someone who would like this podcast? That unlocks insight. And then the second thing, and this is really the gold question, how would you describe the show to that person? Right. And it's a two-parter. Yeah. How would you describe the show to that person? Yeah. And what you're looking for is that unique key and that unique lock that triggers language that people typically don't have ready at the tip of their tongue to talk in positive terms about a podcast.
Yeah. And I want to offer something. If you're listening to this right now and you're wondering how somebody might describe your show, if I am a listener of that show, I would love to help you out. So get in touch with me and I'll let you know if I listen. And if I don't listen, then I'll find somebody who does, because I'm, like I said before, I'm so curious about how somebody would describe my podcast recommendation newsletter or my podcast recommendation podcast or my podcast about podcast trailers. I would love to know. It would be golden information to have this. And then the last question, Tom, is if this show were to die tomorrow, never be produced again, what is one thing, if any, that you'd miss?
I call that the eulogy question. I love that question. But, because one of the possible answers for that, frankly, is nothing. And that's an answer, and you need to know that. Yeah. People can talk about all the things that they might like about a show, but if you make them, what's the thing you'd miss the most? They will typically get more specific and more articulate about that. And that really hones in on the strength of your show, I think.
Yeah, and you give a pretty specific answer for this in your article, so I will direct folks back to that because Tom gets really specific, and I always think being specific is helpful. Hint, it has to do with sports, but not about sports, right? You have a favorite sports podcast, but then your favorite part of this is not exactly sports related. So it's kind of the beauty of how much we love our hosts, and we pretty much stick around for anything that they say, even if it's not directly related to the reason that brought us there in the first place. So when I read this article, I thought, this is amazing. These questions are great. I tweeted about it. A lot of people were like, yes, I need to know these things about my listeners, and I want to find out a way to get this information. But I think that the next step, and we'll talk about this in a future conversation or maybe even in a future article from you, is how do you actually get people to answer these questions? We'll talk about some tactics for how to make that happen, giving incentives. You mentioned merch and other opportunities for the super listeners who are willing to give these answers. So we'll get into that at some point down the line. But anything to share, any way to hint at this?
I mean, the only thing I will say is that, you're really just talking about conversations here, and you're not talking about survey responses. And even if you only talk to 5 or 6 people, if you start to hear the same language, then it means something.
Right. This doesn't have to be a study first of all, and it definitely doesn't have to have a sample size of 1,000 people or even of 50 people. Anything that you get back will ultimately aid in the pursuit of understanding your audience. So, Tom, thank you so much for going through that article with me. I really loved this article because ultimately I think it helps creators and it helps listeners. I'm a big advocate for both. So before we close it out, talk to me about the latest research from Sounds Profitable. What did you uncover and where can folks go to learn more?
We'll be having a webinar of our most recent study, which is called The Medium Moves the Message. And it's a comparative look at broadcast television, AM/FM radio, and podcasting, and the brand effects of all three on the 5 biggest advertisers in each medium. And it's kind of mind-blowing, the results. So I really can't wait to talk about it.
Soundsprofitable.com/research is the place that you can find it. And then one other note before we go is that April is going to be Adopt a Listener Month. As I mentioned before, you and I had a conversation with Lauren Pacell of Tink Media a few weeks ago, and we talked about the need to get more people to listen to podcasts. It is very easy to get somebody who listens to 9 podcasts to listen to 10 podcasts, but getting somebody to go from 0 to 1 is much more difficult, and that is the goal of making April Adopt a Listener Month. There's going to be lots of initiatives. We're going to have blog posts. We're going to have pre-roll ads that you can have your hosts read on their show. We're going to have social posts. So if you want to learn more, make sure you're subscribed to Tink's newsletter, Podcast Marketing Magic. You could get that at podcastmarketingmagic.substack.com. Tom, anything to add about Adopt a Listener Month?
I love it because it's a discrete, achievable thing to do, is to get somebody to just listen to one show as opposed to, let me tell you about podcasting, which, I don't know, that doesn't sound like a good time to me.
I'm just asking for one show. That's it. Give me a chance.
Give me a chance.
Hey, we'd love your thoughts on this episode. Actually, we have 5 very specific questions for you. Just kidding. Maybe another time. But please do reach out if you have any questions or comments. I'm on Twitter at Ari This and That, and Sounds Profitable is at SoundsProf News. We're also on LinkedIn. Just search for Sounds Profitable. If you want to send us an email, you can reach us at podcast@soundsprofitable.com. And Tom, are you on Twitter lately?
I've sporadically, I've dipped in very, very sporadically. I'm at Webby2001 on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn. You know, I'm one of the Tom Websters on LinkedIn. I'm sure you can find the right one. This episode was recorded remotely using Squadcast.fm, the best way to capture high-quality audio and video from anywhere, with anyone, and at any time. That includes you, Arielle. We use Squadcast at Sounds Profitable for our podcast and for all of our product deep dives. To try it out for yourself, go to squadcast.fm and start a free trial. Use the code SPPartners, that's partners, that's plosives, to extend that trial.
To access our articles, product deep dives, the Podscape, our research, and more, head to soundsprofitable.com.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sounds Profitable podcast with me, Tom Webster.
And me, Arielle Nissenblatt.
This episode is put together using Spooler and hosted on Art19. Thanks for listening.